discuss purchase contracts 101 with Keeley. I think this, of course, this is a one-on-one kind of intro topic, but it's good for anybody at all stages, right? These are, these little nuances of a contract are so important, whether you're 1 year in or 10 years in. So a little bit about Keeley for those watching for the first time or joining for the first time and don't know Keeley's background. So I have the good fortune of knowing Keeley since I'm 17 years old when we first started dating in high school. So out of anybody, I have seen her growth as a human, professional, mother, wife, etc. Keeley's an expert at her craft, so she was licensed in 2004. The only job Keeley has ever had is a real estate agent. It's the only job. She has never had a boss in her entire life, which I think is pretty cool. She did lead a team for Keller Williams for a few years, so she reported to a franchisee there, but she left that role to become an REO agent. So these are real estate agents that manage foreclosures for banks. So that was her first soiree into distressed property. So she started managing foreclosures for banks and became an expert at valuation, valuing literally hundreds of properties per year as a part of the broker price opinion process, and then also managing foreclosure projects to bring them to market. So design, disposition, construction, decision making to support value. So Keeley is really smart at what she does. We started flipping houses in 2013, and Keeley has touched every part of the value process from acquiring properties, designing, construction management, disposition. She knows all the nuances, all the psychology of all the stakeholders. So I think she is very well fit to present contracts 101 with us. So excited to see what she shares, all the little tips. So please have your notepads ready. Keely, take us away.
All right. You guys feel free to ask questions at any point in time. I cannot see you guys, so Mark will mediate and kind of call on people. And so just interrupt me if you guys have a question or drop it in the chat and Mark can ask it. But like Mark said, this is going to be contracts 101. So what I want to go over with everybody is the contract as a purchaser. So I want to purchase a home. I'm a flipper. I'm going to make an offer on a property. And then what the contract details are on the sale side. So now I've renovated the house. I'm ready to sell it. And now there's different verbiage and different terms that I'm going to pay attention to on the seller side, right? So you're going to wear two different hats during your flip. You're going to be the purchaser at one point, and you're going to be the seller at one point, and there's kind of different things that you need to be thinking about in each one of those roles. And so we'll kind of run through just the different terms of the contract. Mark had mentioned in the intro, like buyer psychology or just the psychology of the stakeholders in general. And I think that is key to understanding that this entire process, a real estate process, there are lots of different people involved, and really understanding the psychology of people will help you go far in this business. So it's the psychology of the realtors that are involved, it's the psychology of the appraiser, it's the psychology of, the buyer or the seller, whoever's on the other side of the transaction, right? It's a human business, it's a relationship business. And so when you're thinking about being the buyer of a property and making an offer, think about this form, this contract, this offer as communicating a message to the other side. And when you are selling your property, you'll see firsthand that the buyer's offer that they make on your property definitely communicates a message about how serious they are, how much they like the property, whether there's negotiating room, right? All of these different terms in the contract are levers that you can pull or manipulate to communicate something to the other side. And so that's super important, the terms of the contract. What else is important is who's representing you, right? You definitely want, whether you're buying or selling, if you're working with a realtor, you really want to make sure that you're working with the right people. You want to make sure that you're working with somebody that's professional and is also able to really advocate for you and communicate those messages on your behalf, right? Um, Forgive me, guys, I'm sick, so I'm going to try not to like cough throughout this. So kind of jumping into being on the buyer side of it, right? This is a standard as is contract. In the state of Florida, we use two different contracts. We have an as is contract And then we have just like a standard FAR bar contract. The difference of those two contracts is that the standard contract, so not the as is contract, the standard contract, there's a section in that contract that allots for repairs that are agreed upon in advance, and it's typically a percentage. And so when you get an offer on a standard contract or you make an offer on a standard contract, essentially the seller is committing upfront that if anything comes up in the inspection period, up to X amount of dollars or some percentage of the purchase price, like 2.5% of the purchase price or 1% of the purchase price, that they are going to make those repairs and the buyer cannot back out of the deal as long as the repairs don't exceed whatever that predetermined amount is. It's important to know that that contract exists, specifically in case you as a seller ever get an offer on a standard contract. But in the Tampa Bay area specifically, I would say 99.999% of the time, people are using this as is contract. And so the difference with the as is contract is essentially that the seller is saying, hey, this house is being sold as is. I'm not willing to make any repairs to this property. I'm not willing to agree to any repairs up front. And so you, Mr. Buyer or Mrs. Buyer, you need to do all of your own due diligence. You need to have your inspections. You need to decide if this property is for you. I think a couple of important things to understand about that. Just because it says as is doesn't mean that repairs are not negotiated. It's very common that the buyer has their home inspection, things come up in that inspection period, they come back and they ask the seller. The difference is that in the standard contract, the seller would be obligated to fix those things, and under an as-is contract, the seller is not obligated. They can negotiate what they're willing to do, and it's kind of like the buyer and the seller reach a mutual agreement and decide to move forward. The other thing that I would say is that a lot of people, especially investors, tend to think about an as-is contract as being no liability for them, right? They sold the house as is, and the buyer bought the house. And so now something comes up 6 months from now or a year from now, and the buyer wants to sue the investor or the seller. And the seller's like, well, wait a minute, I sold the house as is, you bought the house. An as-is contract or purchasing a house under an LLC, like you are not necessarily released just from kind of like blanket liability. You still do have to make disclosures about things that you know materially affect the property, right? So don't think that just because you're selling the house as is, you can be a shade ball and not disclose things, because if you get caught doing that, you can still get in trouble, right? So a couple of things to note there. But we'll run through kind of the different components of the contract, and talk about those different levers that we can pull, right? So this is just kind of the standard as is contract. This is the one that gets used 99% of the time. This is what your realtor is going to fill out, or if you're making an offer on your own behalf, you would obviously fill this out. Um, so seller's name, right? Buyer's name, the city, I'm sorry, the street address of the property. So numerical, right? Like 6810 North Branch, Tampa, Florida, 33604, located in Hillsborough County, Florida. And then you're going to have things like the property ID and the legal description. And for those of you that don't know, those are things that you're going to find on the property appraiser's website. And we use the property appraiser's website for a couple of different things. So we're going to go, I just Googled like property appraiser website, and then let's see. I have it saved, so I never have to do this. Search. Search real estate. Okay, so you would go to the property appraiser's website and you would do a basic search. Let's do. Okay, so this is where you would find this parcel ID number is going to be what you'll see here, the Florida property tax ID number. And then you've got your legal description down at the bottom. So this is the legal description for this one. And that would go in here. Personal property that's included or excluded. On the buy side, you probably won't use this very often, but let's say that there's some really cool, like antique, like Sterling in his flip, he had really cool, like antique appliances. Just something that maybe you want to make sure is staying with the property, you could go ahead and write it in there. Or if there's something that you're excluding from the property, something that's not, you don't want included in the sale, that could go down here. These are more for like on the sale side of it. You really won't use those very often on the kind of front end when you're purchasing.
So what about things like a washer and a dryer? Would you insert that there? Stuff that you want to keep as an acquirer of the property. You're buying the property, you think that has value, you want it to stay. That's where you identify it, correct?
Yeah, so and like let's say somebody's purchasing something as a rental because a flip, I'm assuming you're probably gonna like want to trash everything. But let's say you were purchasing a property that you plan to just do some minor repairs to and kind of rent out, right? If you look under personal property, like under this item D, it kind of itemizes out what the contract naturally includes. So it is all of the appliances, ceiling fans. It's typically anything that is affixed to the property that it like plugs in or you would take it out. The exception is TVs. Obviously, TVs are not included, but like the TV mount that's in the wall, that typically is supposed to stay at the property because if they took that out, it would cause like major damage to the drywall, right? So yeah, washer and dryer are not typically included in the sale. So if you wanted to keep the washer and dryer that was on site, that would be something that you would write in over here.
What about
Um,
something like a fixed structure, like a shed out back that may be movable? Maybe it's fairly new, but it's on a concrete pad. Is that something you want to identify in the contract
so
if you want to keep?
typically the shed stays, but what I'd say is, you know what? Better safe than sorry. If there's something that you definitely want to stay, go ahead and write it in because this is honestly one area where people like on closing day end up in a lot of disputes. Because the buyer thought that something was staying, the seller thought they could take something, and now everybody's upset and the buyer doesn't want to close. So better safe than sorry. If there's something that you don't see kind of listed out here, that you definitely want to make sure is staying, go ahead and write it in. That way everybody has agreed to it, right? So moving down, we've got purchase price and closing information. So we would put in the purchase price here, right? What is our offer amount? And I think what's important to understand is that obviously when we're making an offer, the amount of our offer is important, but it's not necessarily the most important thing, and it's not the only term, right? So thinking about these different terms and these different kind of levers you can pull if you're making a lower offer to somebody, you definitely want to make sure that your other terms make you look really strong and really serious, right? Um, but whatever that purchase price is, whatever amount you're going to offer, that would go in here. So let's just say we're going to offer $250,000. We found this great house we want to flip. We're going
Really
to
quick, if
offer
you
the
could,
seller, huh?
you did it. I just wanted to clear the text box that was blocking the contract. You're
Oh.
good.
And then here we've got initial deposit. So have you guys all heard of an escrow deposit? It's also known as like a good faith deposit. It's held by the escrow, it's held by the title company, the escrow agent. And it's basically telling the seller, hey, I'm serious about your house. I intend to buy your property. If I default on this contract, you get to keep this amount as repercussions for my default on this contract. But if I proceed with the contract, that amount gets credited to me at closing. So on the buyer side, right? Depending on the situation, you may want to keep this low or you may want to make it really high. Okay. So if there's a property that we're interested in and we absolutely know like we want to buy this property. So I'll give you an example. We purchased a property in Seminole Heights a couple years ago. It came on the market. There were multiple offers. I want to communicate to the seller that I am so serious because there was like hundreds of thousands of dollars of margin in this house, right? So it's important to me to try to win this offer that the seller knows that I am dead ass serious. I want this house, right? So we put $20,000 in escrow. If we default on the contract, you get to keep $20,000, Mr. Seller. Now, let's say that there's a house that I'm not too sure about. I'm just kind of like making offers on things. I don't necessarily care as much. I might offer $5,000 in escrow, right? I might offer $2,500 in escrow. So this is a term that you can use to make yourself look really serious, but that money is being held outside of your account. It's being held by the title company. It's money that I tell people like it's always at risk because people often get into disputes over deals falling apart. And and I'll get to this in a second in something that we do in additional verbiage to protect ourselves. But essentially, the title company is not supposed to release the escrow deposit to anybody unless both the buyer and the seller have signed an agreement as to who is getting what amount of money. The problem is that once you reach that point where the deal has fallen apart, somebody's typically not willing to sign off. Somebody is typically like, nope, I'm not, I don't care if you get it or you don't get it. I don't care if I get it. Like, nobody's going to have it. And then it's just like being held and floating out there. So, what I would say is that if you choose to do a really high escrow, you do want to make sure that you're serious because the higher that escrow is, the more likely you are to get sued for it if you default and you do something wrong, right? The more likely it is that people, if you're in dispute over it, that they will pursue it, right? It's not really worth it for somebody to maybe pursue $2,500, but it's probably worth it for them to pursue you for $20,000, right? So
I
again,
just
this, sorry.
want to take a step back to make sure everybody caught it. So it's because it's more about the nuance of making the offer. So you said, hey, price is really, we all think price is like the end all be all, right? Because that's the price, the amount of money the seller's getting when we make an offer. But you said earlier, actually, price is not the most important term, right, to focus on. And then you gave an example of where we made a really high escrow. Or I should say, we offered up a really high escrow deposit where we had multiple offers in property because the property was being sold at a deep discount to its fair market value at the time. So there was a lot of activity, but we made a super high escrow offer and not necessarily the highest price offer, right? So I want you to just kind of talk a little bit about that nuance and why you think that's important to the seller, just so the group can capture, because I think that's a really big one, right? To make sure that term is buttoned up in accordance to how bad you want the property.
So from the seller's perspective, most sellers don't realize that you would have to agree to release that escrow. Most sellers assume that what this means is that if you default, they automatically just get this check. And so for most sellers, right, like $20,000 makes you look like you're definitely going to purchase the property. And if you didn't purchase the property, they probably don't really care because they just made an extra $20,000 more than what the property was worth and they can just go resell it to somebody else, right? So that escrow deposit, it makes you look extremely serious. Um, it makes it's like an insurance policy, I guess, kind of for the seller, right? They feel really reassured that you're serious and you're going to move forward on the deal. Does that answer that? Does that answer that question?
I think so. And I think it also shows, if you have a high escrow, it shows some form of liquidity. Sometimes
Mhm.
you're getting offers on property, on distressed property, where it's, investors with limited capital, or, maybe they're making multiple offers on properties at the same time, and then they just kind of land and choose one out of their three offers. So they might lock up three contracts, give themselves exit clauses or opt-out clauses in those contracts, and then just choose one of the three properties that they think is best fit. So what that does, in the seller's eyes, is now it's compromised marketability because they fell out of contract. Why is that? It makes them look weaker, right? So I think just by putting up, to your point, a higher escrow offer, it's showing that you are a stronger buyer in general, regardless of what the price you're offering is.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good point. Liquidity is a good point, right? So typically, if you're doing a hard money loan, you're doing 100% financing. Also, if you have a property that's super popular where there's like, call it 10 offers on this property, right? The agent is looking at all of these different levers. They're comparing all of these different offers, and what they're trying to determine is how serious everybody is, how likely they are to close, right? So things like you're up against wholesalers, like let's say I have 10 offers on a fixer upper, and five of those offers are assignable with $1,000 in escrow. Well, those are clearly wholesalers that probably don't intend to purchase the property if they can't find an end buyer. And then I'm going to weed out and I'm going to look at, okay, what are the non-assignable offers and what do they look like? And out of those five non-assignable offers, who's putting down what amount of money? How quickly can they close? What kind of inspection period are they looking at? What is their escrow deposit? And I'm probably going to go with somebody that has a much higher escrow deposit to try to protect my seller and make sure that my seller is locking up with somebody who has liquidity, intends to close on the deal, like is the end buyer, right? So that is definitely something that, like, the liquidity aspect, I think is something that agents definitely do look at to see, to try to help them understand if you're a real buyer for the property, if that makes sense. I'm actually going to use that property in the Heights as our example because I think that'll be kind of a good one to walk through. And we'll write up the contract, kind of like how we made the offer, and then we'll look at when we sold the property, what that looked like. My computer's moving slow. Sorry, guys. Um, okay, so this property, again, it's over in the Heights. We purchased it for 241,000. So
For the group, that was probably 50 or $60,000 below the as is value at the fair market value at the time, right? So
I want to pull up real quick what they were asking for it because I think weren't they asking like 225 for it, I think. Sorry guys, I wasn't planning to do like an actual property or I would have been a little more prepared for this. Okay, so here's when we purchased the property. Okay, so they were listed, if you guys can see here, they were listed at 225 and we purchased it for 241. Okay, so when we made our offer, there's a couple different ways that you can make your offer if you are up against
really,
other
just
offers.
real quick for the group, I just want to give everybody this little tip. So if you hover over the share screen that Keely is sharing, you can zoom into that contract, right? If you can't read it the way that it's showing, you can zoom into it so you can get a little closer and see the verbiage on any of the screens that she's showing. So just a little tip if you can't see it because I know it's a small box.
I also posted a PDF of the contract in school, like just as a post. So you guys could also like pull that up if you wanted to kind of follow along. Okay, so this house was listed for 225. And the day, literally like the minute it came on the market, I was like, okay, we need to purchase this house. We want to buy this house. Um, we offered, there's a couple different ways that you can make your purchase price your offer, right? So there may be houses, and you're going to look at this on a case by case basis, where you're offering less than what they're asking, right? Because that's how your numbers crunch, right? Because we're all trying to buy good deals. We all want to buy it like that 55% of ARV. And so if they're asking 400 and your numbers crunch out to be 350, you would be offering 350. If there's a house that comes on where the margin is really great and you really want to lock it up, right? You might be up against multiple offers. A couple of things that you can do: you could go direct to the listing agent, right? And you could try to make an offer directly with them representing you. What is the advantage of this? The advantage is that real estate agents, this is their career, this is how they pay their bills. Especially right now when the market is really slow. they would love a double-sided commission, right? They would love to get both sides of that deal, assuming that the seller is offering to pay a buyer's agent, right? So kind of going direct to listing agent can help you lock that up. Um, you could offer full price for it if you don't have other offers. You could offer above the asking price, right? Or you could do what's called an escalation clause. And an escalation clause means that you offer a certain amount of money, a set amount of money. So in this case, we offered the $225,000 asking price. But what we did was we put in our additional terms an escalation clause that says, hey, we will beat your highest offer by $1,000. Whatever your highest offer is, we will pay you $1,000 more than what that highest offer is, right? So, which is why you see on here a 241 purchase price. So they had an offer for 240 and we offered $1,000 above their highest offer. So that kicked our offer up to 241, right? That's why this is like such a random number. But an escalation clause is a great tool that you can use to kind of not overpay for a property when you're up against multiple offers. Because
I just want to interject and connect the dots for everybody too. So with the escalation cost, so we said price is not always the most important, right? So we're only $1,000 over the next highest offer because that's the way we structured the escalation clause. But the escrow, right? The escrow was the term that was stronger. So all things being equal, if somebody offers 240 with a $5,000 escrow and you're offering 241 with a $3,000 escrow, they're going to take the 240 with the higher escrow, right? So in this case, we were $1,000 above, but a much higher escrow which strengthened our offer, right?
okay, so when we look at what that looks like on the contract, our end up purchase price was 200. The purchase price we ended up at was $241,000. We had offered them $20,000 in escrow. Okay. This here is going to be the escrow agent's information. So the title company that's handling the deal. For us as buyers, now if the house is listed in MLS and you're working with realtors and it's all, being done kind of on market, the seller is going to pick the title company typically. And now you could pick the title company, but then you have to assume some additional fees, right? It's kind of the standard is that the seller is going to choose the title company. If we're going after an off-market deal, we do always try to see like if the seller is open to just using our title company, and they typically are, right? Because they don't have a relationship with a title company. Um, I highly recommend Boss Law. That's who we like to use. Their information is up on school. They're very investor friendly. So, but whoever the title company is, that information would go in here. We like to do that our escrow deposit is going to be made within 3 days of the contract being signed on. That gives us time to kind of get into the property if we haven't been able to get in there, kind of take a look at it, kind of before we have to put up this chunky amount of money into escrow. Additional deposit. So this doesn't get used very often. This is like if they were going to make another escrow deposit, maybe like after their inspection period was up. Not really something you guys need to know about. This is usually just zero. Financing. If we're doing a hard money loan, we're doing 100% financing typically, right?
Or 10% loan to cost, and for many new investors, 15% down, right? 15% loan to cost.
So whatever your financing terms look like, that's what you're going to put in here, right? And this can be
I should
expressed.
say 90% loan to cost, 85% loan to cost. Sorry, yes.
So this can be
15%
either
down.
a dollar amount or a percentage, however you wanted to put that in. But let's just say 90%. So this is saying, hey, we're going to finance 90% of this purchase price up here. Other kind of same thing. That's typically not something that's used. So that would be zero. And then here is what is the amount that's left to close. I always just write in balance, but you could put in a number, like you could do the math where you did 90% of the 241 minus the $20,000 escrow deposit. And then that's what your kind of cash to close is, not including your closing costs. So this is kind of the money part right? This is our escrow deposit, our purchase price, how much we're financing, etc. If you were doing a cash deal, you would put zero here, right? You're not financing anything. Um, Offer and acceptance. So again, another term or lever that you kind of want to pay attention to. So this is how long does the seller have to respond to your offer? If I'm purchasing a house that's in probate, I probably need to give them 2 weeks to respond to my offer. If this is an offer that, if this is a house that I really want to lock up, I typically want to give them like 24 hours to respond because I don't want them getting other offers, right? I don't want them like, you just never know when somebody else is going to make an offer on a property. So if I'm going after a house that has been on the market for a little while and I'm making an offer and maybe I'm making a lowball offer, kind of, putting down 10,000 or 5,000 in escrow. I'm just trying to like lock this house up. I want the seller to turn around and respond very quickly because I'll give you like a rule in real estate that nobody ever believes. Dead serious, you can have a house sitting on the market for 90 days. If I get an offer on it, I'm probably going to get like two more offers within 24 hours. And then the other parties don't believe you when you're like, I actually just got an offer on this property. They're like, yeah, right, lady, this house been on the market for 90 days. But for whatever reason, it's like once you get one offer, you tend to get another one. So if you're making an offer, you kind of want this time for offer and acceptance to be tight, right? Because you don't want them exploring other options and not locking it up with you. So I would typically do like a 24-hour. So I would give them through tomorrow to respond to us. Closing date. So it's very important when you're making the offer for you to try to find out from the seller or from the seller's agent, the listing agent, what is most important to the seller, right? Sometimes the seller wants to close as quickly as possible. They need to get out of this house. They're going through bankruptcy. Their wife is leaving them. They need money now, yesterday. Some people, elderly people especially, the thought of them having to be out of their house in 2 weeks is very scary to them, right? They got their whole life to pack up. They're sad about leaving. They're just feeling very overwhelmed. They might want 45 days to close, right? This is a term that I would try to explore with the listing side to see what is the seller's preference. This will win you deals, this one term. Being flexible on the closing date, if the seller wants to sell as quickly as possible, right? I need to know, obviously, from my hard money lender how quickly they can close and make sure that I'm giving enough time for that. But I would do a super tight date. I would do 2 weeks out, and I would say, hey, if we can close it sooner, I will close it sooner. I'll do everything in my power to get it closed as quickly as possible. Here's my minimum closing date that I can do, 2 weeks, right? If it's an elderly person and the seller's like, hey, they're really overwhelmed, they really like are struggling, they want some time, I'm going to let them pick the closing date. You tell me when you want to close, right? So having flexibility on this, again, thinking about the seller's psychology and that maybe price is not the most important thing. A lot of investors will just be very aggressive in like their closing date because they just are making the assumption that everybody wants to close super fast. We have literally won deals off of just this one term, off of just being flexible about the closing date because they felt like this other investor wanted them out in 2 weeks. They feel a lot of pressure from that. We're giving them flexibility. And so they're going to go with our offer because it just feels better to them, right? So this is definitely something to kind of dig in on. But let's just assume that these people want to close quickly, right? I'm going to give them like an offer for a 2-week closing. Um, so kind of these
Just real
different,
quick, Keely, in the beginning, let's say you're an early stage flipper, first 1 to 5 deals. What are you thinking in terms of um, your offer timelines? Are you giving yourself a little more time? 2 weeks is better, 3 weeks? What are you thinking?
okay, so what I would say is that a standard loan, right? Just a person doing a conventional or an FHA loan, that's typically going to be a 30-day closing. And so if the person, if the other side, if the seller would like to close as quickly as possible. My suggestion would be that you already kind of have things set up with your hard money lender. Like you've already made application, you've already submitted all of your documents, they have everything they need. Because at that point, they really just need to underwrite the property, right? And then they can probably close it in 2 weeks. As a new investor, I would suggest that you do a 3 week closing if you're not super confident that that your hard money lender can close it in 2 weeks. I would maybe do a 3 week closing. That should be plenty of time for any hard money lender to close the deal. Um, and it's also obviously makes you look like you're able to close quicker than like a conventional buyer who's probably going to put in a 30-day closing if you're up against some conventional type offers. So,
Another pro tip would be, communicate with your home money lender to see what the service level agreement is for the appraisal order, right? Depending on the time of year, like in the spring, depending on the time of year, those appraisal orders might be a 2 week turnaround or more. I don't know if anybody has any familiarity with the recent order, or Mike, if you want to comment, but I think that's important too. You don't want to have a short timeline and then you literally just can't turn it around because the appraisal can't be turned around in time, and that seller is sophisticated or savvy, and they end up walking with your escrow. Mike, any thoughts on timelines for appraisal orders for hard money lenders?
Yeah, so I think it's an important part of your process when you're vetting hard money lenders or any lender for that matter to understand where they're getting appraisers from. So, if they're ordering through an appraisal management company, it's like a third party, right? So essentially the appraisal management company will take the order and then they'll contact someone like me and ask me how much I charge and they keep the difference, right? So I stay away from any hard money lender that uses an appraisal management company typically because they have no control over what appraiser comes out. Typically, it's going to be the cheapest appraiser. You might get an appraisal from Newport Richie for an appraisal in Tampa, or an appraiser from Clearwater for an appraisal in Ruskin. You just want to have somebody that knows the area, right? So, Mark and Keeley use Coastal Equity, and they have two or three appraisers on the panel that like specialize in certain areas. So they call me for Tampa orders, but they also allow you to bring in your own appraiser if you have someone you trust. Not that we can be biased as appraisers, but when you know someone and they know the market, you want them to do the appraisal so that way they really understand it. So I think vetting your lender and asking them where they get their appraiser, can I choose my own? How do you do it? That's an important part of the process. Because yes, the turn time could be astronomical. And sometimes it could be, you just don't hear back from the appraiser for 3 days. And it's like, there's not a lot of communication there. So
and I
you
think with
want to,
appraisals too, it's kind of like you get what you pay for. Because in my experience, like the lenders that try to use these appraisal management companies with like the cheapest possible appraiser, like that appraisal is probably going to take 3 weeks to come back. Like that $150 appraisal is not a priority for that appraiser because he's probably got other deals and other appraisals he's doing for 350 or $400, right? So I think that's a great tip. You definitely want to do like your due diligence, with your hard money lender ahead of time, kind of before you're making offers, so that you know what those timelines look like and you've confirmed that they use a local appraiser and kind of all of those things, right? Because the appraisal obviously can also blow up the deal. Like if you get an appraiser out of Newport Richie that knows nothing about Tampa and thinks that this neighborhood is ghetto, right? They might come in with a super low appraisal. So that's definitely a good tip, like a good question to ask any hard money lenders that you're considering.
Another good point too, Keely. So, and I'll let you move on. But so, as an example, if you have a 2 week turnaround time for the appraisal, or let's say 10-day turnaround time for the appraisal. So you're going to say, okay, I want to do 2 week timeline on the purchase contract, which is 14 days. The issue is that appraisal might come in, not in your favor. So you might actually have to argue that appraisal, right, and ask them to revisit the comps or reevaluate. So you just want to give yourself time, even if you have a 10-day turnaround time. 2 weeks might not be enough time for your contract because you still may have to do some additional due diligence after the appraisal comes back in.
Mhm.
Hopefully, best case scenario, everything comes in fine. We've underwritten our deal really well. But especially in the beginning, when you're still getting comfortable with valuations and making offers, I think a little bit of bandwidth to protect yourself from losing escrow is really important.
For
I
sure.
would add BPOs. So like some lenders allow BPOs. And that's just for me is kind of crazy because they'll still charge you $400 or 450, but that person doing the BPO gets paid like $75, right? So, and sometimes they come through like a third party, like an appraisal management company or just a BPO management company. Like, do you want a real estate agent who is getting paid $75 to determine if you get a hard money loan or not, right? So you want to make sure if you're going to pay $400, like, why can't we just order a regular appraisal? You know what I'm saying? So I've seen some really, like, I've talked to some lenders in this market who are forced to use BPOs and they kill a lot of deals. Like, they just make adjustments out of nowhere. And these aren't your experienced agents like Keeley who really know the market because Keeley's doing deals. She's not doing $75 BPOs, right? So,
Okay, so how I got into REO listing, this is like a side story, little side quest. But so I was doing BPOs like when the market fell apart, kind of like as things were going into foreclosure. And I think about this a lot. Like I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Like I remember like I had no idea like what to deduct for a pool like versus a non-pool or like the acreage. Like I was doing a BPO is essentially a full-blown appraisal, but like the agents that are doing BPOs are like newer agents or like I mean back then the market was like falling apart, so you're just like doing whatever you can do to make income because you weren't selling any houses, right? But like the especially in this market where there's money to be made, I would not trust an agent that's doing a BPO to do a good job and make that determination about my hard money loan. So I would definitely make sure you're using a company that does a full-blown appraisal with a legitimate local appraiser. Because otherwise you just have some 20-something-year-old agent that doesn't know what the hell she's doing. Like, they'll take off 30 grand for the pool, even though like that really should be like a $60,000 adjustment or something,
There's
right?
some sharp 20-something-year-old agents out there. Come on.
Like I made a lot of money on those $75 BPOs back in the day. All right, so moving on, kind of the next bit of the terms, you've got a 14-page contract, right? So there's a lot of terms about like this one is extension of the closing date in the event of a major catastrophic event, right? Like the hurricanes that we had, they delayed a lot of closings, right? So what happens in those events? When do people get to take possession of the property? None of that really matters. I mean, it does if you end up in those situations, but it's for the sake of making an offer, you don't need to know about it. The next most important thing that the listing agent is going to look at from your offer is the assignability of the offer. So there's three different options. First one is the buyer may assign and thereby be released from further liability under this contract. The second one is may assign but will not be released from liability. So the buyers they can assign the deal, but they would still have to perform, right? If the other party that they assigned it to could not perform. Or you have may not assign this contract. If I
Now,
want my offer,
if they don't perform, what is the consequence if they don't perform? They lose escrow.
correct.
What is the consequence? Okay.
So like a wholesaler, for example, would usually check the first box. They would have checked may assign and thereby be released from any further liability under this contract. So that's saying like, hey, I can assign this property to whoever I want. And once I assign it, like I'm done. This is now between you and this new buyer that I've assigned my contract rights to, right? My right to purchase this property. The second box may assign but not be released from liability makes you look more serious, right? You're saying, hey, I want to be able to assign this property, but if this other buyer doesn't perform, I am still liable under the contract, right? So my escrow is still up for grabs, and theoretically, I would still be able to be sued for non-performance, right? That's really what it comes down to, is that you'd be able to be pursued for not performing on the contract. And this is something where let's say that you like to put your houses in separate LLCs, or maybe you like, you own 3 houses in one LLC, and that's kind of like the max that you really want to keep in there. You haven't yet opened another LLC, but this new property pops up that you really want. You just kind of don't have all of your ducks in a row with the paperwork. Like you may also may want to have this box checked so that you can assign this property essentially to yourself, to another LLC that you own, right? So this isn't always about kind of assigning to a whole different buyer. It can also be like somebody who needs to assign it from one LLC to another that where they own both of the LLCs. But if you really want to show that you're not a wholesaler, that you are an end buyer, again, one of those levers that is communicating, I am a serious buyer, it's me, right? You would check may not assign this contract, meaning I can't give this my rights to anybody else. I am the buyer for this property. I am liable to this contract, right? So again, in this example of this house that we really wanted, we absolutely had checked that we were not assigning this contract to anybody else. So moving down into the financing part, you've got option A. This is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. Or you've got option B. This contract is contingent on financing. And then you can see there's like some terms, right? How long of a financing period, what your interest rate will be, what type of loan you're doing, etc. Essentially, the difference between these two things, if you check box A that says you have no financing contingency, it means that let's say you were doing a hard money loan and you got denied for the loan, but you had box A checked, because sometimes people do that. We've done that before where we really want a property and we're not going to have a financing contingency. We will still disclose that we're doing a hard money loan, but we'll check this top box saying that we don't have a financing contingency, because what that says is, hey, once we get through our inspection period, we cannot back out for any reason. If we couldn't get our loan, it wouldn't matter to you. You would still be able to keep our escrow deposit. So in the example of this house that we purchased in Seminole Heights on Lambright, we didn't want any we offered with like no contingencies, no inspection period, no financing contingency. We essentially said, we are going to close on this house, right? All of these terms, us not putting in a financing contingency, us not putting in an inspection period. The communication to the other side is, we cannot back out for any reason. We are going to buy this house. If we don't buy this house for any reason, you get $20,000. Please pick us, right? That's like the most serious you can be in an offer. If you, let's say it's a house that you really, really like, there's lots of offers on it, you feel super confident in your hard money lender, and you know you're going to buy this house regardless, right? You may opt for option A. You may say, hey, I'm not going to do a financing contingency on this house. I really want this house. And if I don't perform on it, then you get to keep my escrow deposit. For the most part, especially for new investors, you want to protect yourself, and that's a different thing, right? So protecting yourself is checking option B and saying, this is contingent on me doing a hard money loan. What is important here is this next box that says, it says this contract is contingent upon within blank days after the effective date. The effective date is once everybody has signed, buyer and seller. I have this contingency, and let me just kind of back up and define a contingency. A contingency is any clause in the contract, like an escape clause. These are the reasons, these are the contingencies under which I would not move forward with this property, right? These are my reasons why I can get out of the contract and get my escrow deposit back. On the seller side, the seller wants, their ideal would be no contingencies, right? Their ideal would be $20,000 in escrow and no contingencies, so that they know if you don't close on the house, they get 20 grand. On the buyer side, if you're trying to protect yourself, what you're wanting to do is look very serious, but also obviously have contingencies in place that protect that escrow deposit, that give you the ability to back out, okay? So if I'm a new investor or a newer investor, I don't have my hard money stuff like super streamlined. I'm not super confident in the valuation. I'm not 100% sure that I could close on this house. I want to have a financing contingency in place to protect my escrow deposit. And typically I want what would be ideal is if that financing contingency is as long as my closing date, like through my closing date. So if I did a 21-day closing, then in this area, I would write in 21 days. Because if for any reason at any point my hard money lender denied me, I would be able to get my escrow deposit back. This is the term that if you get denied for your loan, you get your escrow deposit back. Let's say that you only had like, and again, the reason this is important for you guys to know is like not all agents are great agents. Not all agents are super experienced with working with investors, right? You guys need to be able to kind of fact check the offer that you're making because sometimes agents, they'll just write in whatever. Like an agent might put in 7 days because they want to make your offer look more serious. Okay, so on day 11, you realize that the property didn't appraise and you can't get financing for this property without bringing another $70,000 in cash, which you don't have. And you're like, oh, well, it's fine. I have a financing contingency. Nope, your financing contingency ran out 4 days ago. So now that escrow belongs to the seller, right? Or on the opposite side, you might have an agent that writes up an offer for you and they just leave this blank and they say you need a 30-day contingency. And then the listing agent looks at this offer and they're like, I thought you were a serious investor. Why do you need 30 days to get your shit together on your loan? Like that doesn't make sense, right? You're not that. Again, every component of this offer is communicating to the other side. So this is a term that can make you look like you're more legitimate as an investor or you don't really have your stuff together as an investor, right? So this is an important one. And this is also an important one because it protects your escrow deposit. So kind of moving down, nothing else you really need to know here. This is like if you were going to ask the seller to pay for closing costs that they wouldn't normally pay for. It's not
So,
really
Keely,
something.
if you can go back up, I just want to give some kind of like practical advice so people understand how the industry works. So, as an example for that financing contingency, so this is a gray area, right? Because being denied for the loan, you can have an actual denial. Hey, you're not qualified. Appraisal didn't come through, or something in your bank statements was caught, and you are no longer qualified to buy this loan. Or if you have a relationship with your lender and you decide mid-contract, I found another property that's better, or I no longer want to buy this property for whatever reason, it's basically a bailout clause where you can tell your lender, hey, give me a denial letter. And your lender is a relationship-based person, and they know you're going to continue to do business with them, and they just, they send you over an email or denial letter. They have an official form typically that says you're denied for the loan. So really, this term could be used, to Keely's point, as a real protection for you, where you can bail out at any time. It gives you full flexibility, but understanding that some agents on the other side and some sellers on the other side will be sophisticated enough to really think deeply about this term as a strong part of the overall offering, right? As the what they call the offer mix. So I think you think about that, and wherever you can slide it in for a longer financing contingency, I think that's all the better. It protects you. But in some cases, if the other side is pretty savvy, this is going to be an area where you're going to have to try to keep it as short as possible.
So I think kind of the way to think about that is you have two opposing sides, right? The buyer and the seller. And the goal for each side is to minimize risk to themselves. So if I'm on the seller side, I want no contingencies or I want very short contingency periods, right? Um, because that means that if this person doesn't perform, I get to move on. I get to put my property back on the market and get it resold. And I also get whatever the financial consideration is for them not moving forward, right? I want very short time periods on the seller side. On the buyer side, I want to try to, unless it's like a zinger of a deal, like that one on Lambright, where you're just like, I need them to know that I want this house, like regardless, and I'm willing to gamble $20,000 on that. Um, like on the buyer side, especially as a newer investor, you're really wanting to minimize risk and protect yourself. So you're wanting longer time periods, perhaps. So yeah, that's a good point. Kind of moving through here again, this is all like you guys can read this. These are not, I mean, you should read through the contract and kind of familiarize yourself with all of it, but these are all just kind of like the standards. What happens if this happens? What happens if that happens? Not necessarily things that you need to know to make your offer. Um, Kind of next up is page 4. You've got where they're talking about the title company, who's going to decide who the closing agent is and pay for charges. So typically the seller designates the title company, and each party has their own fees. The buyer can opt to choose the title company, but then they have to cover some of what would traditionally be the seller's closing costs. So again, if it's an on-market deal, like we typically just let the seller choose the title company because I obviously don't want to pay extra fees for no reason. But it's important to have a relationship with your own title company. What we will do is we will reach out to our regular title company, to Boss Law, and we'll say, hey, we're picking up this property. Can you guys just do a quick check for us? Let us know your thoughts. Let us know if you see any red flags. If you've worked with a title company for a while, like they're fine doing stuff like that for you because they know they're going to get the business on the back end. When you list the property, you're going to use them to sell it, right? So again, relationships are important. They can really help you. If we're dealing with an off-market seller, they typically don't have a relationship with a title company. I'll ask them like, hey, do you have a preferred title company? If they say no, I check the seller box. Seller's choosing the title company. I say, oh, I have a great title company, Boss Law. Do you want to just use them? And they'll say, yeah. And they're like none the wiser. And it's a great thing because we get to use our title company and not pay any additional fees. Next up, you have home warranty. Obviously, when you're making offers on properties, you're wanting to look serious. You're not a conventional buyer. You're not going to ask for a home warranty. So you're going to check the NA. Nobody's getting a home warranty. Okay, special assessments. So this one, there's 2 different options. A special assessment is basically like something like an amount of money that's levied against a property, typically for something like infrastructure. So let's say that the city is repaving all of the roads in a certain neighborhood. They might levy a special assessment against each property based off of how much road frontage they have. So they're going to take the $1 million that it's going to cost to repave this neighborhood, and then they're going to subdivide it among all of those houses based off of how much road frontage they have, and they're going to levy a special assessment against that neighborhood. Like there's all different examples of this. Tico running underground power, right? Just different improvements typically to the neighborhood. If a house has special assessments levied against it, that can either be handled where the seller pays for the special assessment in full prior to closing or at closing, or the special assessment gets prorated similar to how property taxes get prorated. So meaning the seller is going to pay for their portion of the year of that special assessment. Like let's say they've owned the property for 3 months. They're going to pay the first 3 months of that special assessment. And then now you as the new property owner, now you're taking over the special assessment. So I guess the thing to know about there is maybe digging in via the property appraiser or the tax collector and seeing if there are any special assessments levied against a property and how you want to handle that individually. We typically just do like the installment, the first box, which is basically that it gets prorated. And then when we resell it, we do the same thing and we prorate it on the backside. So, all right, now we move down to page 5, property inspection and right to cancel. This term here is, remember in the beginning, we talked about the as-is contract, right? The as-is contract says, hey, the seller is selling this house as is, or me as the buyer, I'm buying this house as is, and I have to do all of my own due diligence to decide if I want to move forward with this property in this condition. This is your inspection period. This is your period where you can cancel for any reason whatsoever. So if you remembered like the standard contract, not the as-is contract, but the standard contract, you would not be able to cancel if the repairs are within that pre-negotiated amount. With an as-is contract, you can cancel for any reason. You don't even have to give them a reason. It could just be like, it rained today, I'm over it, I'm not buying a house. And you can cancel the contract during this inspection period. So if you want to look serious, the inspection period is going to be really small, right? Maybe 0, maybe 3 days, 5 days, 7 days. If you're concerned about the property, if you really want to get a GC in there to look at things before you fully commit, this is the timeline that you have to be able to cancel and get your escrow deposit back. So, let's say the property looks like it has some structural stuff going on. You might need a 10-day inspection period to get structural people out there to look at the property and give you an assessment before you decide to move forward. So again, this is another lever that you can pull to either look super serious, meaning 0 days, right? Or 1 day or 2 days. Like, I just want to get in there, look at it just 1 day, and then I'm over it. I'll move forward. Or it might be a lever that you need to pull to try to protect yourself. If you have concerns about the property, if you're wanting to get somebody in to look at it. If you're a newer investor, because this is one of the challenges that new investors face. If you're a new investor, something to think about is like, people don't really want to give you more than like a week. Like 7 days, I think I'm still serious. Like 5 to 7 days is like showing that you're serious and you're going to work diligently to make a decision, but you're also like having a window of protection for yourself. I wouldn't do 0 days unless you're 100% confident in the property, that you want to purchase it. You're not concerned about the condition. You're not concerned about getting anybody in there. Like, you're just ready to go. If you're needing to have a contractor come out and look at it and give you some pricing or something, then you definitely need to have an inspection period in there so that you can cancel. That's what this term is, this inspection and cancel period. All right, so now rest is kind of just kind of jargon about what happens in different situations. And then once you get down to additional terms and addenda, so this is page 11. So a couple of things that the seller side has to provide to you would be a flood disclosure. That's new, actually. That's just within the last 6 months or so that they now require flood disclosures. So the listing side should provide you, if you're doing like if you're buying something on market on MLS where the seller is represented by a realtor, the realtor should have a flood disclosure. They should have a seller's property disclosure, and they should have any other disclosures that pertain to that specific house. So if the house was built before 1978, then they should have a lead-based paint disclosure. If the house is in an HOA, there should be an HOA addendum that tells you what's going on with the HOA. So whatever addendums are required, those would be checked here, and those would be documents that the listing side provides to you to be able to review. And I'll show you guys what the seller's disclosure looks like in a second, because we have to talk
We
about
have a
that.
question in the chat from Tyler. I think it's good for the group and for the video too. So I'll ask the question and get your thoughts. Do most wholesalers require a 0-day inspection period? A few properties I have been looking at all have had 0-day inspection periods, but you can have the option to walk the property. So what are your thoughts there?
I would say yes. So wholesalers, they are in the business of flipping the contract, flipping the paper, right? When what they have negotiated with the seller is probably a very short inspection period for themselves. What they're trying to do by having 0-day inspection period is they're trying to make sure that you're a serious buyer, right? They're trying to make sure that you're actually going to close. They don't want you to be able to back out of the deal and now they don't have enough time to go and find another buyer for this property, and then they don't get paid because they didn't sell the property to anybody, right? So it's like a chain, right? So the wholesaler, they make an offer and they're offering an inspection period. And they're going to have a cancellation period with the seller. So they might say, a 5-day or a 7-day or a 10-day inspection period. That's essentially their time to hurry up and lock up a new buyer, right? So how do they lock up the new buyer? They need to make sure that the new buyer can't get out of the contract, because then they are not able to sell that. They don't have time to find a different buyer to sell that paper to somebody else, right? So, yes, it's very common for wholesalers to say zero days for inspection and let you walk the property. I would be very careful as a new investor, about dealing with wholesalers. There's a lot of good wholesalers out there. There's a lot of honest ones. There are some dishonest ones. I would say more than anything else, there's just a lot of uneducated ones who they don't know anything about construction. They don't really understand property valuations. Like there's no like licensing to be a wholesaler. So there's no like, as a realtor, I have a code of ethics that I have to subscribe to. I have to perform a certain way. I can't give out bad information. Same thing with like Mike being an appraiser. He's licensed, right? He can't fudge numbers. He can't lie about things. He has to deal honestly and fairly. Wholesalers are not under that same regulation, right? And so, not to say that they're like intentionally harming people, but a lot of wholesalers will unintentionally harm people, right? I've had people buy deals from wholesalers where the wholesaler told them it had a brand new roof, it had a brand new AC, it didn't need any major mechanicals. These people bought the house based off of that wholesaler's word. They bought that house, they didn't do their own due diligence, they didn't really check it out, and it didn't have any of that stuff. And so now their project went from being profitable, but now they have to put in $30,000 into major mechanicals, and now there's no profit. And they're like, well, you told me that it had all of these things. And the wholesaler's like, well, that's what the seller told me. Like, I don't know what to tell you. So
I just want to give some thoughts here too. I think it's important. So, the wholesaler, they're treating you no matter what stage you're at, first deal or your 50th deal. You are the investor, and the onus is on you to do your due diligence, to know your business, to know about construction, to know about property in general, right? And from their position, they're just trying to bring a home to a buyer, right? And make the difference. But truly, all of the due diligence is on you. So, they get a bad rap and we give them a bad rap. I think if once you get into your career and you have teams in place and your costs are pretty moderate or they're low, wholesalers can be a huge asset to you. I have a friend right now who's already bought 8 properties this year. He's going to be very profitable on every single one of them. But the difference is he's got 3 crews that work at a very low labor rate. So he's doing full gut rehabs for 70, 80,000. That costs me 110, 120,000. So when a wholesaler brings him a deal, he can pay a little bit more for it because his labor costs are so low. So it ends up working out for him on the number side. And then also when it comes to just construction knowledge, this particular investor, he's not going to really run into too many circumstances that he hasn't seen before or that he can't fix or overcome at a fairly moderate or low cost because he has the teams in place. So truly, when you're working with a wholesaler, it's not that they're bad, but I think they're probably best positioned for experienced investors and people who have a strong construction and real estate knowledge. Until you really get there, you want to make sure that you're going into contract on deals where you have some bandwidth, whether that's on your inspection period, your financing period, just overall, exit clauses in case you go to acquire a property and you find out early on there's unforeseen things that you're just not ready to handle. Right?
I think that's a great point, because again, I don't think that, I think in this business, there are lots of people in all different spaces, not just wholesalers, but there are lots of people in all different spaces that lack experience, right? They're all learning. Everybody's learning, and you don't know what you don't know until you know it and until you run into it, right? And so, you know, I don't think that for the most part, like wholesalers are not, they're not doing anything to intentionally harm people. It's not like they're like, oh, let me lie and like, but they might just not have any experience or they might not really understand. So to Mark's point, I think looking at wholesalers as they're a facilitator. They're doing the legwork to get sellers to the table, and they're just trying to find somebody that that deal is a good fit for, right? And so what works for one investor doesn't necessarily work for another investor. Like Mark's friend might be buying deals or can definitely buy deals that are way higher priced than what we can buy them at, right? And so for the wholesaler, like they're not responsible to know your numbers. They're not responsible to understand what your financial situation is, or they have no idea what you pay your crews, right? Everybody pays different things. They're saying, hey, I have this property. Here's the information I have about it, and I need to lock it up. And they're in business. So they need to lock it up. They need to lock up a serious buyer, and they're not allowing an inspection period. You, as a new investor, it's your responsibility to protect yourself and it's your responsibility to protect your money. Where it gets a little bit predatory, and I'm not saying that this is intentional, but just something that you need to be aware of. Again, we're thinking about psychology and human emotion is I'm an investor, I'm a new investor, I'm an excited investor. I got some money burning a hole in my pocket. I can't wait to turn an ugly house beautiful and post it on my social media, and it's going to be a great time. And I really like this house. It's really cute. And I've been house hunting for 7 months and I haven't found anything. And this investor's, this wholesaler, he's telling me it's a great deal and it doesn't need anything and it doesn't need major mechanicals and it's an amazing house and I just need to buy it because if not, I'm going to lose out on it. Don't let that pressure, that sales pressure and that fear, that FOMO, fear of missing out, make you make a bad decision. Like ultimately it's up to you. To Mark's point, the properties that wholesalers have are better positioned to go to, or that situation is better positioned for an experienced investor. There's lots of times where we don't do inspection periods. We're just assuming that the house needs everything, right? We've done enough projects that we know what our costs are. We know that this house was built in the 50s. It's going to need a full rewire. It's going to need a panel. It's going to need plumbing. And we've just budgeted all of that. We don't need an inspection period. We're not going to have anybody walk the property, right? The problem is that a lot of times the numbers don't crunch with wholesalers, right? And so wholesalers tend to need new investors that don't really know their costs, don't really know their numbers to maybe get under contract. So that's where it can get a little bit like kind of high pressure. And you just need to not succumb to that pressure. You need to recognize that if it's not the right house for you because you're not being given any time to dig in and you're not comfortable, then don't do it. So that was a
One
very
more tip, and then we'll move on. So, wholesaler brings you a deal. We're offering them 85% of what they brought you that deal for, no matter what. Do not give a wholesaler 100% or 95
I'm
or
going to
even
disagree with that because you know what?
90%.
If a wholesaler brought me a deal for 250 grand and that house was worth 600, I'm going to pay him a bonus. I'm going to give him the whole price and I'm going to give him another
Fair,
$10 to
fair,
say
fair.
thank you.
Be a
So
negotiator. So we have another question in the chat. It's a good one too. So I'll bring it. So Hannah asks, can you touch on the tax proration clause you mentioned on another call that we had? The one that protects the buyer if there's a crazy high tax bill.
yes. So that really is going to affect you on the sale side. It's typically not going to affect you as a buyer if you're flipping the property because you're going to be out of that project before it gets reassessed like that. Um, the kind of the tricky thing about the tax proration stuff is that it's all about the time of year that you purchase the house, how long you hold the house for, right? So hold that thought for 1 second because we're gonna run through this contract on the as the seller, and we're gonna talk about that specific topic because that's important, and I have some additional verbiage. And the seller side is gonna go a lot faster because we obviously don't need to comb through the whole thing again. So real quick on the additional terms when I'm the buyer, these are two terms, two bits of verbiage that I suggest that you guys put into your additional terms or have your realtor put into your additional terms as a couple of things that you need to protect yourself. When we post the full Zoom, I'll have this verbiage. I'll have a blank contract. I'll have everything kind of attached in the classroom. So you can write this down if you want to, but it will also be in the classroom kind of permanently for you guys to access. The two things are going to be seller will close out all permits and resolve all code violations prior to closing. A lot of people assume that any permits, any like issues, well, first of all, a lot of new investors don't even realize the drama that expired or outdated or unresolved permits and code violations can cause. That's number one. These are not permit issues, are not a title defect. So if you go under contract on a house, they're going to look up like liens and they're going to look up different things. But just because a house has expired permits, a lot of title companies don't even do permit searches. This is something that you specifically need to ask the title company to do. And it's also not an escape clause for you to get out of the contract. So if you don't have this verbiage, and let's say that somebody did a whole addition to a house and they didn't permit it, they didn't close out the permits and they failed things, it is such a mess to try to unravel open permits when a lot of them are like years old. The contractor has moved on. He might not even be in business anymore. Him and the seller probably had a fallout. He wasn't paid all of his money. Like these things can be a nightmare. Same thing with code violations. I had a seller, he flipped an entire house, an investor. I designed it for him. We put it on the market. We got it under contract. And lo and behold, it had all sorts of permit issues on the addition, as well as code violations. I'm talking like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he had to hire an attorney. He had to go through litigation with the city. He ended up having to settle. I think he paid like 10 grand to clear the code violations. It was an absolute nightmare. And he held that property for a year while he went through that. So he's also paying $5,000 a month for a year. He lost money on that project because of the code violations and open permits. Because what happens is now you as an investor, you come in, you start flipping this house and you pull permits on it. The city doesn't care that this was the last owner's problem. You're now the owner. So you now need to resolve all of these things. And so when they're coming on your property and they're like, well, you have these unresolved permit issues. And by the way, this addition's not up to code. You got to tear this whole thing out. So guys, you really want to make sure that you've got this one term in here to be able to protect yourself. Because if the seller cannot close out all of their permits and resolve their code violations prior to closing, they have defaulted on the contract and you get out of the contract and you don't inherit their headaches. The other thing I want to point out on this additional term is when you, excuse me, when you get a property under contract, you want to reach out to your title company, preferably, so that you don't get charged for it, or the title company that's handling the closing, and you want to specifically request that they do a permit search and that they look up the code violations. You want to know what's going on with that property as it regards the city of Tampa or Pinellas County or wherever you're at. Like these things are not just, you inherit those problems. They don't just go away. And you can't just tell the city, well, I didn't know it had permit issues and I didn't know it had code violations and I didn't do any of that work. So it's not my problem. The city's going to say, we don't care. The city only cares about the condition of the property and it meeting certain standards, and they don't care whose problem it is, right? So do yourself a favor, include this verbiage and ask the title company to pull these searches for you, even if you have to pay a little bit more money to make sure that you're not inheriting a whole host of headaches that can put you upside down on a property. And then the other thing to put in your contract, if buyer opts to cancel during the inspection period, title will release the escrow deposit to the buyer at the buyer's sole discretion without requiring a release and cancellation. Why is that important? Because, again, once you put that money in escrow, in order for it to be released, both parties have to sign off and agree who's getting paid and how much they're getting paid. So if I have $20,000 that I put in escrow or $10,000 that I put in escrow, and during my inspection period, I decide this property is not for me, it's got a lot of headaches. But Mr. Seller is a certifiable nut job. And he's like, no, you went under contract on my property. And he doesn't understand that I have the right to cancel. Guess what? If he doesn't sign off on that release, your escrow is locked up, tied up. You got to go to court. Title company is not just going to release that to you because it's not up to them to decide or determine who's in default of contract, right? They can only they're a neutral third party, so they can only release that escrow if both parties have agreed to release it. But if you have this term in your contract, then it alleviates that for the title company. And as long as you're within your inspection period, the title company should release your escrow to you without requiring that release and cancellation. Guys, do not underestimate the fact that people are absolutely insane. Okay? That people are, they don't think with their right mind. They do things old school because they sold a house in 1922 and this is how it went in 1922. You're not a man of your word. You said you were going to buy my house. I don't care that there's structural issues. I don't care that you have the right to cancel. I'm not signing anything for you. Okay. So again, make sure that you protect yourself. So these are two terms that you're going to put in on the buyer side.
So Hannah
Real
had a
quick.
question about the buyer side. Do you recommend doing that on the buyer side for traditional transactions? So non-investor transactions. Just an agent question. So Hannah, do you know what she's asking, Keely, or do you need her to specify? Because this is
So I would say, so here's always the balance, right? Is you're wheeling and dealing, you're negotiating, you're trying to look a certain way. Um, in a traditional sale, I feel like, people are going to be kind of more sketchy about signing off on certain verbiage or certain things versus if they know that you're an investor and they're selling like a piece of crap fixer upper. I don't usually put it in my like traditional real estate deals. I will put the permit and code violation thing on my contracts. Because I obviously don't want my buyer to inherit problems, right? But the like opting to cancel during the inspection period escrow release thing, if there's another agent involved, like I'm representing the buyer, they have a listing agent, I don't usually put that in. I feel like it just freaks out the seller side, makes them feel like you're not as serious and like it's not necessary because the agent is going to say, like, the agent is kind of dictating the sale at that point, right? The agent's going to say, well, if you don't sign off on this release, we can't put your house back on the market. Like their agent is going to reason with them. So I don't really feel like it's needed as much on the traditional side. That second point, the first point, I would still put in like on your traditional contracts. All right, so real quick, I'm going to show you guys, oh, sorry. Oh, my page is like huge, so I can't figure out how to get out of here. Okay, so now real quick, I'm going to show you guys on, well, this is the seller's disclosure. Let me show you guys that real quick. So when I'm the buyer, the listing side should be providing me with a flood disclosure, which is very important right now, right? Understanding if the property had flood damage back because of these storms. But just in general, it's good to know. They should be providing you with a flood disclosure and then a seller's disclosure. Okay, so this is the seller's real property disclosure, excuse me. And it runs through like structural systems, termites with their water intrusion, plumbing, roof. This should give you a lot of information that would be helpful to you in assessing your numbers, right? Like how old is the plumbing system? How old is the roof? Like all of that should be in here. Also, if they lie on anything, like this is recourse for you to sue them. Like let's say they said it had a new roof and then it didn't have a new roof and you had to put a $15,000 roof on it and you can take this to court and say they disclosed that it had a brand new roof and it did not, right? So these are documents that if you're doing like an on-market deal, the listing agent should have these and they should be providing these to you. If you're doing an off-market deal, obviously you're probably not going to get these items, right? You could ask the seller to fill one out. I would encourage you to ask the seller to fill one out, but typically off market's a different animal. You're trying to make it easy for them. They don't want to deal with this. That's why they're selling it off market. It's a little more kind of like at your own risk. But if you're buying something from MLS, you should be getting these forms. On the other side of that, when you go to sell a property, okay, so you've renovated the house, you flipped it, now you're ready to sell it, okay? You are going to fill out a flood disclosure as well. And ideally a seller's disclosure, okay? You are not released from liability to disclose things that materially affect the house. Okay, so if let's say that you know that the house had a fire, right? 10 years ago before you bought it, the house had a fire, and that's why you bought it because it was a house that had caught on fire. And you go and you've done everything, you've rewired it and you fixed it and it looks beautiful and everything's like covered up, right? You have to disclose that that house caught on fire because you know that that house had a fire at one point. So you're not released just because you're an investor, just because you purchased the property in an LLC, just because you're selling it as an as-is deal, you are not released from liability to disclose information that materially affects the house, right? So there's structural problems at the property, or there's bad pipes, or whatever it is. What is important about this? Thinking about when you're renovating your property, thinking about when you're flipping, okay? We talked about this at Sterling's on-site. I gave the example of a house that we sold that had old plumbing that we didn't replace the plumbing, okay? When you are renovating a property, if you're aware of something, or let's say that you get the property under contract and the buyer has a home inspection and the house comes back with all sorts of issues, you now know about those issues. They cancel their contract and you go back on market. Guess what? Legally, you're supposed to disclose all of those issues that you know about. So what I want you guys to think about is when you're actually doing the flip, when you're actually renovating the property, the goal is to not run into that situation, okay? The goal is to, now I'm not saying that you have to redo everything 100% and have the property completely perfect. If you're disclosing and if the buyer has their inspections and they're still willing to move forward, all is well, all is kosher, right? Those people, we disclosed that we had not replaced the plumbing that was under the slab. We gave them, I think, like a 10-day inspection period and then an additional like 5 days because they needed more time to have a plumbing inspection. Totally fine, right? A month, 2 months later, they run into a plumbing issue and they're calling us upset. Guess what? We disclosed it. We gave you an opportunity. You still proceeded to purchase the house as is. Therefore, this is not our issue. So understand that you're not released from liability from disclosure of things that adversely affect the house. Your ideal situation as a seller is that you renovate the house, you get it under contract with the first buyer, they're super happy with it, nothing is wrong, and you don't go back on market, okay? Because if you go back on market, you now have to disclose those problems. So had those buyers decided to cancel their contract, we then would have had to go back on market and disclose that we knew that the pipes underneath the house were not in great condition, right? So, it's important to understand that you want to try to eliminate as many of those like kind of red flag issues for buyers as possible. Again, you might not be flipping it 150% and doing 100% of everything, right? But you want to make sure that like the red flags that would cause a buyer to cancel, that those are buttoned up. So, and I said this at Sterling's on site, I would encourage you guys to, once you've flipped the house, go ahead and invest in a home inspection. have an independent home inspector go out there and give you a report just like they would give to a buyer. And if there's electrical issues or there's, a truss in the attic that's rotten or there's clogged pipes, right? Whatever the case may be, just go ahead and fix those things before you put it on market, before you get it under contract. Because especially in this market where buyers are afraid and they're kind of finicky and they cancel over every little thing, you do not want your buyer to cancel and then you have to disclose negative things about your property. It's going to make it very difficult to sell. It's going to make it potentially sell for less money or make you have to tear stuff out and redo things, right? So just understanding that this is something that you have to provide, it's something that you have to disclose to people on the backside. I'm going to show you guys the contract real quick from the seller side. And I want to show you sale contract. I'm going to scroll all the way down real quick to the additional verbiage, and we'll talk about these two things. So along the same vein of the requirement to disclose, you can have some brokerages have. So if you list with an agent, you're going to want to ask them, do they have a non-occupancy disclosure, right? So like Piney Woods is who I work for. We have a non-occupancy disclosure form that literally says this seller is an investor. They've never lived in this property. Like they don't know much about it, basically. And that it's up to you, Mr. Buyer, to do your own due diligence. It's kind of redundant, right? Because that's what the as is contract also says. But this is kind of like reiterating. If they do not have a non-occupancy agreement, I would definitely, in your additional terms, put in this verbiage. Seller has never occupied the property. All provided information, meaning that the seller has provided to you, is deemed accurate but not guaranteed, and seller implies no warranties on the property. It is the sole responsibility of the buyer to inspect the property and determine its condition to be acceptable prior to closing. That's essentially what's in the non-occupancy agreement. And so, like for us, when we fill out the seller disclosure, we're going to have a non-occupancy form that the buyer has to sign that says that they understand this isn't our primary residence. We've never lived in this house. Like we can only give you the information that we have, but you really need to do your own due diligence and make sure that this property is acceptable to you prior to closing. So we're going to provide them the flood disclosure. We're going to provide them the seller's disclosure with what we know. And then we're going to provide them the non-occupancy, which basically says, hey, all this information, like this is to the best of our knowledge, but it's not like we lived in this house for 10 years and we know everything about this property, right? So just a little like CYA. The other thing that Hannah brought up is the property tax prorations. So this is another lesson, right? In this business, we learn lessons because they cost us money and we don't know until we experience it. And me and Mark experienced this, and we want you guys to learn from it so that you don't end up like we ended up at the closing table arguing and having to give the buyer a huge credit. So again, these terms that I'm talking about right now are you've now flipped your property and you are on the seller side. How am I protecting myself as a seller? I'm wanting to make sure that I disclose what I know and that I also have some sort of form or additional verbiage that lets the buyer clearly know that I've not occupied this property and that they need to do their own due diligence. And then the other thing that I want to protect myself on is these damn property tax prorations. So in the state of Florida, we have homestead for primary residences, right? So that means when I buy a primary residence and I file for homestead exemption with the property appraiser's office and I say, hey, this is my primary residence. At that point, I get a deduction on my assessed value, right? Typically 50,000. If you're a widow, you might have, or a veteran, right? They have higher deductions on their property, on their assessments, which means a lower property tax bill. Some people are even exempt from paying property taxes. I've seen people with $0. I believe if you're a fully disabled veteran, you pay no property taxes whatsoever. Okay. So it also, there's another law or regulation in the state of Florida called Save Our Homes. And that says that the property tax bills cannot increase more than like 3% or 3.5% annually. What that's in place for, it's meant to protect like elderly people who are on fixed incomes, right? Or just in general, the public in general. Like for 5 years during COVID, we see this massive increase in property values. If property taxes, if assessments, if properties had been being reassessed every year and those tax liabilities had been increasing based off of these new assessments, people would not be able to afford to live in their homes anymore, right? You have people who maybe are paying $1,000 a year or $1,600 a year in property taxes. If their tax bill was to jump up to $12,000 a year, that's $1,000 a month, and they're on Social Security. They lose their house. They can't live in that house. So the Save Our Homes is in place to protect people from very dramatic property tax increases. What happens is when you as an investor, when you buy a house that some little old lady has owned for a lot of years and it's been homesteaded, her tax bill is $750 a year. When you purchase that home, it triggers a reassessment, right? The city is going to see little old lady, she no longer lives here. It's no longer her primary residence. Amazing. We can now reassess this property at its true market value for today because, right, she's been capped. She's not been allowed to have her property taxes increase, and we want to collect a lot more money on this property. This tax bill has been artificially low for a very long time. And now here's our chance to reassess this property and collect the appropriate amount of taxes. So I'm buying a fixer-upper for $241,000, right? This house on Lambright. These people have owned this house forever. Their tax bill $750. I purchased the property for $240,000 because it's still a junky fixer-upper. My tax bill might go up to $3,000 a year, okay? We resold that house for $650,000. So when that new buyer bought the house 7 months later, it got reassessed again. Okay, now at the market value of $650,000. The property appraiser's assessment doesn't quite align with that, but they essentially can now assess it at a higher amount because it had all sorts of improvements done to it, right? So it's now worth more money. What happens is eventually that tax bill catches up to that new buyer. Okay. I know this is a lot. So if you guys have questions or need me to repeat something, like feel free, because this is a big thing and it's tricky. Okay. So when I now sell this house as an investor to a new buyer for $650,000, okay, in the standard verbiage of the contract, like up in here somewhere, prorations and credits under item K. It basically says that the taxes are by default, they're prorated on whatever the current year's tax is. And you can see that like at the very bottom of page 9. Taxes shall be prorated based on the current year's tax. If the closing occurs on a date when current year's millage is not fixed, but the current year's assessment is available, the taxes are prorated on that, blah, 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 blah. Essentially what they're saying is the taxes are still being prorated at this closing. Me as the seller, the investor, I'm selling this house on Lambright. I paid $241 for it. I'm selling it for $650. The taxes are still going to be way artificially low relative to this new buyer that's purchasing at $650, okay? Because it may not even have been assessed yet, depending on the time of year I purchased it. There may not even be a new assessment. The prorations may still be based off a little old lady's assessment at $650 a year. Maybe it was reassessed. Now it's the end of the year when I'm selling it. So it was reassessed. And now the taxes are based off of that 241 purchase, no improvements having been done to the property, right? So the tax bill is now $1,300 a year, $1,500 a year. When when Joe Buyer buys this property from me and it gets reassessed, his taxes are going to jump to $10,000 a year. Okay. That's normal. But if his agent has not explained that to him, he is going to be so caught off guard in 6 months or 8 months or a year when he gets the real tax bill and his escrow account was based off of $1,700 and now he's in the negative in his escrow account by $6,000. Oh, and by the way, his mortgage payment is getting readjusted based off of the new tax bill and his mortgage payment's going up $700 a month. And then guess what happens? He calls you, or he has an attorney call you, or his previous agent calls you because now she's getting screamed at by him because she didn't tell him about this. And now they're looking for like something from you. Okay. Here's what happens. This clause in the contract, this like standard clause that's in the contract, it says two things. It says, hey, we're going to base the assessments off of this, off of the previous year or the current year's millage, essentially this artificially low tax bill. But if the buyer wants us to estimate the taxes and base the prorations off of the estimate, you can request that. The buyer can request that, right? That's down here on the next page. A tax proration based on an estimate shall at either party's request be readjusted upon receipt of the current year's tax bill. It also says that they can come back when they get their new tax bill, they can come back to you as the seller and essentially ask you for money, right? Because your prorations at closing were not accurate because they were just based off of this previous year's assessment. What does all of that mean to you? What is the real life example? We're sitting at the closing table with our notary at our kitchen table, signing documents, and we get a call from the attorney, from the title company, that the buyer is wanting the tax prorations readjusted based off of the new estimated tax bill. Essentially, what that meant was they wanted us to give them something like $4,500 at the closing table towards their new tax bill that they knew was going to come down the pipe, right? And it's smart of them. Like, if I'm a buyer, I do want that. And so we're on the other side of this, and I'm like, no, we're not giving them any money. What are you talking about? We got attorneys involved. We went back and forth for the entire day. And lo and behold, absolutely, that's something that they had the right to do. We weren't aware of it. And it cost us thousands of dollars at the closing table. We have also had buyers come back 6 months, 8 months, a year after we closed on the property, where their agent did not explain to them how dramatically their tax bill was going to increase. They came back to us, contacted us through the title company, essentially wanting another, like, I think it was like $3,000 based off of their prorations. Now, we said no to it, told them to sue us. They never sued us, and it just died. But they do have the right to do that. And maybe somebody's not going to pursue you for $3,000. But if we're talking about taxes going from increasing by $20,000, like, they may well pursue you in court for that, right? So this term right here, it's going to protect you from that, because what I'm saying in this term, property tax prorations are based on the most current tax assessment or bill at the time of closing, which, keep in mind, is an artificially low tax bill, right? But what I'm saying is, screw that other term, that other verbiage where you guys can, at the closing table, screw us over and request a reassessment. We're agreeing that we're going to base these tax prorations off of the current tax bill that we have at the time of closing, the artificially low tax bill. Although most people don't know all of this, right? Even their agent might not know all of this, so they just sign off on it. But what you're doing is you're protecting yourself from some savvy snake of an agent that does know this and screws you out of $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 at the closing table. Second part, and all prorations are final at closing, meaning 7 months from now, 8 months from now, 9 months from now, don't call me and ask me for money when you get your new tax bill, because we've already agreed that the prorations we did at closing, that was all you were getting. So this term protects you from that. Real quick, the other things, I know we've gone really long on time here. I'll wrap it up, and then if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. So when you're on the sale side of this contract, it's essentially all the same terms, right? It's the same exact contract. So your agent's going to fill out, or the agent making an offer representing a buyer is going to submit this to your agent, and it's going to have all that same information. Couple things you should pay attention to. The personal property line. So while this probably doesn't matter much when you're the buyer, especially if you're doing a flip where you're just going to gut everything and you don't care about anything staying, it does matter on the sale side. I have seen buyers write in a washer and dryer being included when there was no washer and dryer in the house. I had a buyer write in all of the staging furniture would be included in the sale. This line you need to pay attention to, because if you sign off on a contract that says that a washer and dryer is included, even if there's not guess what's going to happen at the closing table? You're going to have to buy them a washer and dryer. Even worse, if you sign off on something, you've staged the house, and this sneaky ass agent writes in there that the staging furniture is included, you might be in real trouble because you're supposed to provide all of the furniture that's in that house. Maybe the staging company doesn't even want to sell it, but even if they did, it's probably a lot of money to purchase that staging furniture off of them. So pay attention to this personal property line and what is written on there, because people will sneak in some stuff. Okay. What you want to put in is that those things are excluded, right? There is no staging furniture included in this, right? So that may be something that you want to write in on this line E for exclusions. Going through the other terms, as the seller, obviously purchase price, you're going to care about that. This escrow deposit, you want it to be as high as possible. We typically on our properties, which are, 500 to $1 million ARV, but most of them are like, 5 to 700,000 ARV. I want at least $10,000 in escrow. Like if you don't have $10,000 as a buyer to put up in escrow, you're not the right buyer for me. I want good assurance. I want my buyer to be bound financially to this property. I want my title company holding that $10,000. Okay. Point number 2, have a great title company that you work with. They are going to help protect you. They are a neutral third party, the transaction facilitator in the state of Florida. But if you are in relationship with them, they're going to help you tremendously. They'll have in there what their financing terms are, right? Are they a conventional buyer? Are they FHA? You can tell by how much money they're putting down. Ideally, I want a buyer that has skin in the game. I want a buyer that's financially sound. So the higher, the better. But, if you're in a lower price point, if you're selling a house in a lower price point, it's not uncommon to get, an FHA buyer that's putting 3.5% down. VA loans are 100% financing. There's also things like there's different programs for like nurses and doctors that are 100% financing. So if I see 100% financing with like a VA buyer or a doctor or something like that, I just really want to dig in with their lender, or you're going to have your realtor dig in with their lender and make sure that they're not 100% financing because they're completely broke. They're 100% financing because they're taking advantage of a benefit to them. I want buyers that if the appraisal comes in a little bit low, they've got 20 or 30 grand to throw at that. I want buyers that when things come back on the inspection, they're not like counting pennies and they want me to fix every little thing, right? Like if people have a little bit of cash, the deal is going to be easier to get done. Time for offer and acceptance. Not really super important to you on the sale side. One thing that I want to mention about this one specific term, though, is your agent should always make sure that as people are signing off, that this has not expired. Okay. Let's say that the time for offer and acceptance was yesterday, but we're still negotiating today. This needs to be crossed out and a new date needs to be put in here. Because if you guys go through this entire process and you agree on the contract and you guys all signed after that time for acceptance, my understanding, and I'm not an attorney, but my understanding is the offer is actually null and void. So if the buyer backed out, you would have no recourse because it wasn't executed prior to that date. So CYA, I would just make sure that this date is reflective of a date beyond when everybody has signed off, right? You'll have a closing date in here. You're going to pay attention to the financing terms. Again, on the seller side, we want to minimize these dates, right? So when I'm the seller, I want to give them maybe a 14-day financing contingency. Like if you can't get your loan together in 14 days, you're probably not the right buyer. Like I don't want my house held up off market, me paying holding costs, and you having all of these super long timelines to be able to get out of the deal. You need to move quickly through your inspection period. You need to move quickly through your loan process. And I need to know that you're locked up and that escrow is mine if something falls out, right? So I would keep this as short as possible. 21 days is kind of like, that's a lot to me. Like I'll give them 21 days if it's a slow market, they're the only thing we have to work with. Okay, like I got to give a little bit, but you want to try to keep that as short as possible. Um, seller shall designate closing agent and pay for owner's title policy. Again, you want to be in control of the title company that's being used. So pay the fees, use your own title company. Okay, home warranty. This can be a great move strategically. Um, let's say that you renovate a home and you kind of like don't do maybe 100% of everything. You may want to consider offering a home warranty. They're like 350 to $1,000. You can offer them like 500 bucks. There's a line in here that says, so it says at closing, and then you check either buyer or seller shall pay for a home warranty plan issued by so and so at a cost not to exceed blank. So what we usually do is we would put that the seller will pay for a home warranty issued by, and then we put buyer's choice, not to exceed $500. This will save you headaches. So going back to the people that we had the plumbing issue with, we always offer a home warranty in our listings, because then guess what? If they call and they say, hey, the AC that you didn't replace because it was only 3 years old, the flux capacitor stopped working. We're like, well, we provided you a home warranty. Call the home warranty company. Like we didn't warranty the AC. We didn't replace the AC, right? So this can save you some headaches because it gives them like somebody else to call if there's a problem after closing. So this may be something that you guys want to budget for as well. Just kind of when you're crunching your numbers on the resale side, just budget that you're going to give $500 toward a home warranty. It's another one of those things that kind of allows you to not take on liability and wash your hands of a deal once it's off of your plate. You don't want to be like fixing things for buyers for years of your life, right? And a lot of first-time home buyers don't understand that they're homeowners now. It's not a rental. They can't just call somebody. They got to deal with it themselves. So this home warranty, it helps you, it helps their agent, because what's going to happen is they're going to call their agent pissed off. And then if their agent doesn't have anything to offer them, that agent's going to call you to try to get you to do something to help them. But if this home warranty is in place, the agent's just going to say, well, hey, they provided you a home warranty. Let me resend you the home warranty company's information. And then those people just kind of disappear. Special assessments, again, kind of same thing, depending on what the assessment is and how much it is. On the seller side, I would say you typically always want to have that you're going to pay it in installments. You don't want to be responsible for paying. If this box B is checked, and again, not all realtors are great, right? So when you're listing your property, make sure that you understand how to review this contract on your own, because maybe a new agent, they don't really realize what this means. Box B is checked that says that you're going to pay for it in full, and it's a $12,000 assessment. Okay. And now at closing, you're paying $12,000 to pay off the assessment. So you want to make sure that box A is checked regardless. Moving down, this is their right to cancel, their right to inspect and cancel. You want to keep that as short as possible. On our deals, when we're selling, we typically try to do 5 days. Kind of max is 7. And I just have like a very transparent conversation with the agent where we're saying, hey, listen, we don't want to have our house off the market forever. We'll give you a 5-day right to inspect and cancel. If for some reason you have an issue getting an inspector in there in the next 5 days, we can give you a couple more days. But ideally, we want them to decide very quickly. If they give a hard time, we'll give 7 days. Seven's kind of like my max that I want to give. That's a week of my house being off the market. It's a week of me losing marketing time, a week of holding costs for me. And like your guy just needs to figure out if they're serious. We will extend the inspection period. Now, again, everybody handles their own business differently. For us, I want the buyer to not be able to ever say that they bought something that they didn't know what they were getting. Okay. I want the buyer to do whatever due diligence they want to do to feel comfortable. Sometimes they'll have their general home inspection and then they'll decide that they also want to have a plumbing inspection, but that might be a week out before a plumber can get out there. We will extend and give them a few more days. That's just our personal policy. So, you guys can handle that kind of however you want. Just understand that with the inspection period, your house is off market and you're losing marketing time. So you do want to try to minimize that as much as possible. And then you're going to provide whatever disclosures need to be provided. So again, you're going to have your, flood disclosure, your non-occupancy, seller's property disclosure, and then any of these that are applicable to, your sale, like if there's an HOA or lead-based paint or whatever. One thing that often you'll get is an appraisal contingency if you're priced really high. So that's another contingency. Just be aware that if the house doesn't appraise, it gives the buyer the right to back out of the deal. We won't dive in because we're like way over time, but just understand that if you have an appraisal contingency as part of an offer that comes to you, what they're saying is, hey, we're not super confident that this house is going to appraise. And if it doesn't appraise, we want to be able to back out. So that's it on the seller side. I know that was a